Welcome to Mr. Phantom, where fear hides in every shadow and chilling tales come to life. Before we start, make sure to subscribe and like this video to get a scary story every night. Tonight, let yourself drift into a story that will take you to a small suburban house, a place where something unusual is happening. A statue stands still in the yard, yet every morning, it seems to have shifted just a little. Is it just an illusion? Or is there something deeper lurking beneath the surface? Take a deep breath. Let each word flow like a whisper in the night. The soft glow of the evening surrounds you. The steady ticking of a clock fills the silence, and the world outside begins to fade away. This is not just a story to hear, but a journey to feel. A tale of buried secrets, of silence that speaks, and of a figure that should not move, but does. Close your eyes if you wish. Embrace the calm, and prepare to step into the story of the moving statue in the yard. I had just moved into this house a week ago. A modest home in the suburbs of a small town, far from the hustle and bustle of the big city that had drained me for years. I thought living here would bring the peace I had always longed for. The neighborhood was quiet, the streets were clean, and the neighbors seemed friendly. At least, that's what I thought at first. But from the moment I arrived, something felt off. It wasn't something I could immediately pinpoint, but it was there, a creeping sensation, like a thin mist wrapping around my mind, refusing to let go. It wasn't the town itself. The scenery was picturesque, almost too perfect. The trees lining the streets swayed gently in the wind. The sound of birds chirping in the early morning filled the air, and a small park at the end of the road made the neighborhood look warm and inviting. Yet, none of that truly stood out to me. What stood out, what unnerved me the most, was the statue in my neighbor's yard. My neighbor, Mr. Benjamin, lived in the house right next to mine. His house was larger than mine, with an old-fashioned architectural style that made it look slightly eerie. The paint was fading, the iron fence was rusting in spots, and there was an overall sense of neglect. But the most unsettling thing wasn't the house itself. It was the statue standing in the middle of his yard. The statue depicted a teenage boy, perhaps 16 or 17 years old. His expression was what disturbed me the most. His face wasn't neutral or artistic, as most statues tended to be. Instead, he looked terrified. His mouth was slightly open, as if he wanted to scream but couldn't. His hands were frozen mid-motion, as though reaching out for something or someone. His wide eyes stared blankly ahead, giving the impression that he had witnessed something horrifying before turning to stone. From the moment I saw it, I felt uncomfortable. Something about it made my skin crawl. On my first day, as I was unloading boxes from the moving truck, I kept glancing at the statue. It felt as though its empty eyes were watching me. I told myself it was just my imagination, that it was just an ordinary decoration. Perhaps Mr. Benjamin had a strange taste in art. But the feeling didn't go away. Then I met Mr. Benjamin himself. He was a man in his late 50s, with graying hair and deep lines on his face. He was tall, thin, and had an air of coldness around him. When he first approached me, I expected a warm welcome, a polite introduction. Instead, all he did was stand by the fence, watching me silently for a few moments before finally speaking. "You're the new tenant," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. I nodded. "Yes, my name is Dylan. Nice to meet you." I extended my hand, but he didn't take it. Instead, he gave me a brief nod and looked me over, as if assessing something about me. "You live alone?" he asked abruptly. I hesitated. It was an odd question to ask a stranger, especially as the first conversation. "Yeah, just me." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then his eyes flickered toward the statue. "Don't stay out too late at night," he finally said. And then he turned around and walked back inside his house without another word. I stood there, watching him disappear behind his door, feeling an inexplicable chill run down my spine. That night, as I settled into my new home, I found my mind drifting back to the statue. There was something about it, something that didn't feel right. But I tried to brush off the feeling. After all, it was just a statue. What harm could it possibly do? But then, something strange happened. The next morning, as I stepped outside to retrieve my mail, I glanced at the statue again. And I swear, it had moved. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Maybe I had simply misremembered its exact position. But the more I looked at it, the more certain I became. The angle of its head was slightly different. Its arms, which had previously been slightly raised, now seemed to be in a lower position. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was enough to make my stomach twist in unease. I looked around, wondering if Mr. Benjamin had moved it. But why would he? And even if he had, why change its position by such a small amount? It didn't make sense. Trying to shake off the unease, I went about my day. But as the sun began to set, the feeling of being watched returned. I would glance out the window and see the statue standing there, its lifeless eyes staring forward. Every time I looked at it, I felt my heart beat a little faster. By the third day, my unease turned into something closer to fear. The statue had moved again. This time, there was no doubt. It wasn't just my imagination. The arms had lowered even more, and the head had tilted slightly downward. It was as if it was slowly shifting, bit by bit, night after night. That evening, I saw Mr. Benjamin outside, watering his plants as the sun dipped below the horizon. Summoning my courage, I approached him. "Mr. Benjamin," I started, trying to keep my voice casual. "I've been meaning to ask about that statue in your yard." He didn't look at me. "What about it?" I hesitated. I noticed that it seems to move." This time, he turned to face me. His expression was unreadable, his eyes dark. For a long moment, he simply stared at me, and I regretted bringing it up. Then he said in a quiet, measured voice, "It doesn't move." I opened my mouth to argue, but something in his tone stopped me. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the way he said them. It wasn't a statement. It was a warning. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. My mind kept circling back to the statue, to Mr. Benjamin's odd behavior, to the way it seemed to change positions when no one was looking. Around midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to check. Slowly, I crept to my window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek outside. The street was silent, illuminated only by the dim glow of the streetlights. Everything was still, and then my breath caught in my throat. The statue was no longer facing forward. It was facing my house. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what was happening, but one thing was clear. Something was very, very wrong with that statue. I didn't sleep that night. I tried. I really did. I turned off the lights, closed my eyes, and tried to push all the disturbing thoughts out of my mind. But no matter how much I told myself that it was just a coincidence, just my imagination playing tricks on me, the feeling wouldn't go away. The feeling that something was watching me. At some point in the night, I grabbed my phone and searched for any information I could find about Mr. Benjamin or his house. But the internet was frustratingly unhelpful. There were no strange stories, no reports of anything unusual, just a few basic property records and a mention of his name in an old town directory. Nothing about the statue. Nothing about him being involved in anything out of the ordinary. And yet my gut told me there was more to this than I could see. By morning, my exhaustion was nearly unbearable, but the first thing I did after getting out of bed was check outside. The statue was still there, exactly where it had been the night before, still facing my house. I stood at the window for a long time, just staring at it. I needed to know if I was losing my mind. With slow, cautious steps, I made my way outside. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew-covered grass and faint traces of someone brewing coffee nearby. But none of that mattered. My entire focus was on the statue. Up close, it was even more disturbing. The details in the face, the subtle lines of fear, the slightly parted lips, the unblinking eyes, made it look almost real. Like it had been frozen in place rather than sculpted by an artist. The longer I looked at it, the worse the feeling in my stomach became. Without really thinking, I reached out and touched it. Cold, hard, stone. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Of course, it was stone. What else would it be? Still, I needed to know for sure if it was moving. I stepped back, taking careful note of exactly where the statue stood. I even took a few pictures on my phone, capturing every angle just to be sure. Then, with one last uneasy glance at Mr. Benjamin's house, I turned and went back inside. That day, I tried to go about my normal routine, unpacking, setting up furniture, making the place feel more like home. But no matter what I did, my thoughts kept drifting back to the statue, to Mr. Benjamin, to the way he had warned me not to stay out late at night. By late afternoon, I decided to ask around. If there was something strange going on, the neighbors might know. The first person I approached was an elderly woman who lived 2 houses down. She was tending to her flower bed when I walked up, a warm smile on her face, at least until I mentioned Mr. Benjamin. "Oh," she said, her smile faltering. "You're his new neighbor, aren't you?" I nodded. "Yeah, I was just wondering if you knew anything about him. He seems a little odd." She hesitated. "He keeps to himself. Has for years. Doesn't really talk to anyone unless he has to." I glanced back toward his house. "Do you know anything about the statue in his yard?" Her entire expression changed. The warmth disappeared from her face, replaced by something I couldn't quite define. Fear, maybe, or discomfort. She lowered her gardening tools and wiped her hands on her apron, avoiding my gaze. "It's just a statue," she said too quickly. "Nothing to be concerned about." The way she said it, the exact same way Mr. Benjamin had, sent a chill down my spine. "Has it always been there?" I pressed. She didn't answer right away. When she finally did, her voice was softer. "A long time," she murmured. "Longer than I've lived here." Something about the way she said it made my skin crawl. I thanked her and moved on, trying a few other neighbors, but the response was always the same. Avoidance. Deflection. No one wanted to talk about Mr. Benjamin or his statue. Some even pretended not to know anything at all. By the time I got back home, my unease had turned into full-fledged paranoia. That night, I stayed up late, staring out the window at the statue. I told myself I was just being foolish, that I was obsessing over nothing. But deep down, I knew I was right. Something was happening. And then, just past midnight, I saw it. A flicker of movement. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe it was a trick of the shadows, or my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But no, there was no mistaking it. The statue had moved. Not much. Just a slight shift, a tiny tilt of the head. But it had moved. I wanted to believe that the wind had somehow nudged it, that the foundation it stood on was unstable. But my rational mind knew better. Statues didn't move on their own. I needed proof. I grabbed my phone and opened the pictures I had taken that morning, comparing them to what I was seeing now. And sure enough, the statue was in a different position. The arms had lowered even further. The expression somehow looked even more desperate. My heart pounded in my chest. I needed to know what was happening. And so, without thinking about the consequences, I grabbed a small flashlight and a jacket and stepped outside. The air was colder than it had been earlier, and the neighborhood was eerily silent. Even the usual night sounds, crickets, the occasional distant bark of a dog, seemed absent, as if the entire street was holding its breath. I approached the statue cautiously, every step making my pulse race faster. When I reached it, I hesitated. It was one thing to observe from a distance, but standing right in front of it, in the middle of the night, was something else entirely. I lifted my flashlight and shone it directly onto the statue. Nothing happened, just cold, unmoving stone. I exhaled shakily, feeling foolish. Maybe I was letting my imagination get the better of me. Maybe the stress of moving had made me paranoid. Maybe. A rustling sound behind me. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my grip. The bushes near Mr. Benjamin's house trembled slightly, but there was no wind. My pulse thundered in my ears. And then I heard it. A voice. Low, almost whisper-like, drifting from the direction of the house. "You shouldn't be out here." I nearly dropped the flashlight. Mr. Benjamin was standing on his porch, half shrouded in darkness. His eyes were fixed on me, his expression unreadable. My mouth was dry, but I forced myself to speak. The statue had moved. His face didn't change. "Go back inside, Dylan." Something about the way he said my name sent a shiver through me. "Why won't anyone talk about it?" I demanded. Silence. Then he took a slow step forward. Some things are better left alone. I wanted to argue. I wanted to demand answers. But something in his eyes, something dark, something warning, kept me rooted in place. And so, without another word, I turned and walked back into my house, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep, and when morning came, the statue had moved again. I was done pretending everything was normal. For days, I had ignored my instincts, dismissed my fears, and tried to rationalize what was happening. But now, there was no denying it. The statue was moving. And worse, Mr. Benjamin knew something about it. His cold, cryptic warning echoed in my mind. Some things are better left alone. But I wasn't going to leave it alone. That morning, after another sleepless night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my phone screen. The pictures I had taken showed undeniable proof. The statue had changed positions. Its head was slightly tilted downward now, its hands almost brushing against its own chest. The shift was subtle, but it was there. I ran my fingers through my hair, trying to think. There had to be a way to prove what was happening. If the statue moved at night, then I needed to catch it in the act. That's when the idea struck me. CCTV. I didn't have security cameras installed yet, but I had an old home surveillance system packed away in one of my boxes. I had barely even unpacked, but that didn't matter. I needed answers, and I needed them now. I spent the next few hours setting everything up. I positioned one camera inside my house, pointed directly out the window toward Mr. Benjamin's yard. Then, I placed another one outside on my porch, giving me a wider view of his lawn and the statue. I connected them to my phone, ensuring I could monitor the footage in real time. As the sun began to set, I checked the angles one last time. Everything was in place. All I had to do now was wait. The night felt different. The usual suburban calm had an edge to it, like the silence was too deliberate, too heavy. Even inside my house, I felt the weight of it pressing down on me. Every creak in the walls, every distant rustle outside made my nerves jump. I sat on my couch with my phone in my hand, staring at the live feed from the cameras. The statue stood still in Mr. Benjamin's yard, just as it had the night before. I watched it for hours, barely blinking, my heart hammering in my chest. Nothing happened. At least, not at first. It was just after 2:30 a.m. when I saw it. At first, it was subtle. A flicker of motion, so small I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I sat up straight, gripping my phone tighter, my breath catching in my throat. I rewound the footage, playing it in slow motion. There, the statue's head moved. Only slightly, just a tiny shift, but it moved. I covered my mouth with my hand, my pulse racing. I forced myself to stay calm, to keep watching. A minute passed, then another, then movement again. This time, it wasn't subtle. The statue's arm twitched, its fingers curling slightly, as though it was clenching a fist. I jerked backward on my couch, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. My logical brain screamed that this was impossible. Statues didn't move. They couldn't move. And yet, here it was, moving. I watched, frozen in horror, as the statue took its first step. It wasn't smooth. Its legs didn't bend naturally the way a human's would. Instead, it shifted forward in small, jerky motions, like something trying to remember how to walk. Its face, its face, remained locked in that same expression of fear, its wide eyes staring forward as if trapped in its own nightmare. My breathing turned shallow. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. Step. Another step. It was slow, almost hesitant, like it was testing its own ability to move. But it was definitely moving. Panic clawed at my throat. I needed to do something. But what? What could I possibly do against something like this? A sudden noise outside snapped me out of my thoughts. A rustling sound, soft but unmistakable. I turned my head toward the window. The statue was gone. My stomach dropped. I scrambled to check the live feed again, scanning the footage frantically. My fingers shook as I switched between camera angles, trying to find it. And then there it was. Closer. It had moved to the edge of Mr. Benjamin's yard, just feet from my house. It was standing still again, its face tilted slightly upward, toward my window. Toward me. I swore under my breath, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. What the hell was I supposed to do? I grabbed my phone and started recording the screen, making sure I had proof. I needed to show someone. I needed someone to believe me. But then, something else happened. The front door to Mr. Benjamin's house creaked open. The statue didn't move, but it was as if it had been summoned. A shadow stepped onto the porch. Mr. Benjamin. He stood there for a moment, looking down at the statue. His expression was unreadable, but something about it sent a wave of nausea through me. Then he spoke. "I told you not to interfere, Dylan." My entire body went cold. How did he know I was watching? I ducked lower, barely breathing as I kept my eyes on the screen. Mr. Benjamin took a step forward, placing a hand on the statue's shoulder. It didn't react, didn't move. And then, the statue's head turned toward him. I swear I saw something flicker across his face, fear. Just for a second. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he guided the statue back to its original position, like he was resetting it. I watched, unable to move, as he whispered something under his breath. The statue remained motionless now, as if frozen in place once again. Satisfied, Mr. Benjamin turned and walked back inside his house, closing the door behind him. The street fell silent once more. For several minutes, I just sat there, my mind reeling. What the hell had I just witnessed? It wasn't just the statue moving. It wasn't just some weird illusion. Mr. Benjamin knew. He was controlling it. Or worse, he was keeping it trapped. My hands trembled as I saved the recording, backing it up in multiple places. Whatever this was, it was beyond anything I had ever encountered. And one thing was painfully clear. I wasn't just dealing with a creepy statue. I was dealing with something much, much worse. And I had a feeling I was running out of time to figure out what. Sleep was no longer an option. After what I had seen, after watching that thing move, after seeing Mr. Benjamin calmly reset it like he was adjusting a piece of furniture, my mind refused to shut down. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The way its stone limbs jerked unnaturally forward, the way its face remained frozen in terror. But the worst part wasn't the statue itself. It was the way Mr. Benjamin had spoken, the way he had looked straight into the darkness and called my name. He knew. He had known I was watching, had known I was spying on him. And yet, he hadn't confronted me. He hadn't knocked on my door or issued any direct threats. No. Instead, he had simply put the statue back in place. Like it was a routine. Like he had done it before. Like he had been doing it for a very long time. I needed to know the truth. By morning, my exhaustion was a living thing, dragging at my limbs and clouding my thoughts. But I pushed through it because I had work to do. I wasn't going to sit around and wait for Mr. Benjamin to make the next move. I grabbed my laptop and started digging. At first, I found nothing. Just basic property records, confirming that Mr. Benjamin had lived in the house for nearly 40 years. That fact alone sent a chill through me. He had been here for decades. If the statue had been moving all this time, how had no one noticed? Or worse, how many people had noticed, only to disappear? I searched for missing persons reports in the area, but nothing connected. No strange disappearances, no unsolved cases. It was frustrating. Then I tried something else. Instead of searching for Mr. Benjamin, I searched for his house. And that's when I found it. An old newspaper article, buried in the archives of a forgotten local news site. The page was dated over 30 years ago. I clicked the link, my hands shaking. Samuel Benjamin, age 16, was reported missing late last night. His father, Richard Benjamin, stated that the boy was last seen in their home before going to bed. Neighbors claim that young Samuel was a quiet but polite boy, known for spending most of his time indoors. A police investigation is ongoing, though no evidence of foul play has been discovered. Mr. Benjamin has asked for privacy during this difficult time. My stomach twisted. Samuel Benjamin. Mr. Benjamin had a son, and he had disappeared 30 years ago. I stared at the words, my mind racing. This wasn't just some eerie statue in a neighbor's yard. This was something else. This was a person, or at least it had been. I needed to know more. I spent the next few hours gathering every scrap of information I could find. But strangely, there was nothing else about Samuel. No follow-ups. No updates. It was as if he had simply been forgotten. I checked social media, but of course, there was nothing. This had happened before the internet was even a thing. There were no relatives listed in the reports, no interviews with concerned friends or family. It was like Samuel had never existed. Except he had. And now, his terrified face was carved into stone in Mr. Benjamin's yard. I needed more than old articles. I needed answers from someone who had lived through this, which meant I had to go back to the neighbors. I started with Mrs. Green, the elderly woman who had seemed uncomfortable when I first asked about Mr. Benjamin. When she answered the door, her expression immediately darkened. "You again," she said, her voice wary. "I need to ask you something," I said quickly, before she could shut the door in my face. "It's important." She hesitated. I lowered my voice. "It's about Samuel." The reaction was instant. Her entire body stiffened. Her knuckles whitened on the doorframe. And for a long moment, I thought she was going to slam the door in my face. Instead, she let out a slow breath and muttered, "Come inside." Mrs. Green's house smelled like cinnamon and old books. The curtains were drawn, leaving the living room in soft, dim light. She sat across from me, hands folded in her lap. "You shouldn't have looked into this," she said. "I didn't have a choice," I replied. "The statue." "It's not a statue," she interrupted. I swallowed. "Then what is it?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then she whispered, "Samuel." I felt ice crawl down my spine. "I knew him when he was a boy," she continued, staring at nothing. "He was kind, quiet, never caused trouble." Her voice grew softer. "But something changed in that house. Something happened. And then he was gone." I leaned forward. "Did anyone ever find out what happened to him?" She shook her head. "No. But we knew. We all knew." "Knew what?" "That his father had done something to him." My breath hitched. "No one could prove it," she murmured. "No evidence. No witnesses. Just a boy who went to bed one night and never woke up." She exhaled shakily. "We tried to forget, to move on, but then the statue appeared." I gripped the edge of my seat. "When?" "Months later. One day, it was just there. In the yard. No explanation." I stared at her. "And no one questioned it?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Of course we did. But Mr. Benjamin just said it was a tribute. That was all. And the police," she shook her head. "They didn't care. No body, no crime." I felt sick. "People started avoiding his house after that," she went on. "We knew. We didn't want to know how, but we knew what that thing was." Her voice trembled. "And then it started moving." I gripped the armrest. "How long?" "Years," she whispered. "Only at night. Only when no one was watching." She swallowed. "Except we were watching." I leaned back, my mind reeling. "So why hasn't anyone done anything?" She gave me a sad look. "Because anyone who gets too involved disappears." My blood ran cold. "You need to stop, Dylan." Her voice was urgent now. "You need to let it go. Leave it alone. Because if you don't..." A sudden, sharp knock on the door made both of us jump. The room fell into silence. Then another knock. Slow. Measured. Mrs. Green grabbed my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Go. Now." I didn't need to be told twice. I hurried to the back door, slipping out into the alley behind her house. My heart was pounding as I rushed back toward my own home, glancing over my shoulder the entire way. When I finally reached my front door, I turned one last time and froze. Mr. Benjamin was standing in his yard. The statue was no longer in its usual spot. Instead, it was facing my house. Directly. My breath hitched. Mr. Benjamin raised a hand in a slow, almost casual wave. And then, without a word, he turned and went inside, leaving the statue exactly where it was, watching me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Even after I locked every door, shut every curtain, and kept every light in my house burning, I felt watched. The knowledge that the statue had moved again, this time facing my house, made my skin crawl. It was a warning, or maybe a message. Either way, it meant something had changed. I sat by my window, peering through the blinds, my heart thudding in my chest. Mr. Benjamin's yard was dimly lit by the faint glow of his porch light, casting long, eerie shadows across the lawn. And there, standing unnaturally still, was the statue. It wasn't in its usual position anymore. It was closer now, just a few feet away from the property line between our houses, closer to me, and its face. I felt a shudder run through my body. The frozen expression of terror looked different now, though I knew it hadn't changed. But something about it, something in the way its wide, stone eyes seemed to bore into me, felt more alive than before, like it knew I had uncovered the truth, like it was waiting. But for what? I forced myself to look away, my breathing uneven. No more running, no more pretending. I had come too far to stop now. I needed to find out exactly what Mr. Benjamin was doing, and that meant I had to watch him. The next day, I followed my routine as if nothing had happened. I went outside, watered the plants in my front yard, and took a slow, casual walk down the sidewalk. But in reality, I was watching him. Mr. Benjamin was outside, as he always was in the early mornings. He knelt by the base of the statue, his movements slow and deliberate, his expression unreadable. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but his lips moved, whispering something under his breath. A ritual. That's what it felt like. He placed his hand on the statue's shoulder, almost tenderly, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw his fingers twitch, as though they had just touched something cold. Then, without another word, he stood up, dusted off his pants, and walked back inside. The statue remained exactly where it was, waiting. For the next 3 days, I observed him. Mr. Benjamin never left the house for long. Occasionally, he went into town for groceries, but he was always back within an hour. Most of the time, he stayed home. He rarely interacted with anyone, and even when he did, his conversations were brief. But every night, without fail, he visited the statue. He always went outside between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m., moving quietly, as if he didn't want anyone to see him. He would place his hands on the statue, whisper something to it, then stand there in silence for several minutes before going back inside. And then, without explanation, the statue would move. Never when I was watching directly. Never when I was recording. But always by morning, it had shifted, an arm raised slightly higher, its feet angled differently, its head tilted just enough to be noticeable. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to get closer. That night, I waited until Mr. Benjamin finished his routine and went back inside. Then, heart pounding, I grabbed a flashlight and crept out of my house. The air was thick with silence. Not even the usual night sounds. No crickets, no wind, nothing. As if the entire street was holding its breath. I reached the edge of Mr. Benjamin's yard. The statue loomed in front of me, taller than I had realized, its stone form casting a long shadow in the dim moonlight. Up close, the details were even more horrifying. It wasn't a generic sculpture. It was too real. Every fold of clothing, every line in its face was intricately detailed. The pupils in its eyes were slightly uneven, like a real person's would be. The veins in its hands were carved with disturbing precision. And then there was its face. Frozen, terrified, trapped. My breath came in short, shallow bursts. I reached out, hesitating for only a moment before pressing my fingers against the stone. Cold. Not just the chill of a normal statue left outside overnight. No, this was unnatural cold. A deep, biting freeze that made my fingertips numb within seconds. I jerked my hand back, suddenly aware of the way my heart was hammering against my ribs. And then, a whisper, faint, almost non-existent. But there, I spun around, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Nothing, just the empty street, the quiet houses, the darkened windows. But I had heard it. I turned back to the statue, my skin crawling. The whisper hadn't come from behind me. It had come from in front of me. I took a step back, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run. But before I could move, Dylan, my entire body locked up. I knew that voice. I had heard it before. Slowly, I turned my head toward the house. And there, standing in the open doorway, was Mr. Benjamin. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't angry. His face was completely blank, devoid of any emotion. But his eyes were watching me with something I couldn't quite understand. Something calculating. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. He stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate. "I told you to leave this alone." I backed up another step, my heart hammering in my chest. What is it?" I managed to choke out. "What did you do to him?" Mr. Benjamin sighed, and for the first time, I saw something in his face that I hadn't expected. Sadness. "You shouldn't have come," he murmured again. Then, the statue moved. Not much. Not a full step. Just a shift. A barely noticeable twitch in its fingers. But I saw it. I felt it. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. Didn't stop until I was safely inside my house, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. I collapsed against the door, struggling to breathe. Outside, through the blinds, I saw Mr. Benjamin standing in the yard, watching me. The statue remained where it was. But now, its head was tilted in a different direction. Not toward Mr. Benjamin. Not toward the street. Directly toward me. I had gone too far. And I had a terrible feeling that I was running out of time. I didn't sleep. I didn't even try. I sat curled up in the corner of my living room, clutching a baseball bat with white-knuckled fingers, my eyes locked on the window. Every nerve in my body was on fire, waiting, listening. Outside, the statue stood exactly where I had last seen it. It hadn't moved since I ran back inside. Or at least, I didn't think it had. But every time I blinked, every time I let my eyes drift even for a second, a sick feeling twisted in my gut. Had it shifted? Was its face tilted slightly more in my direction? Was I imagining it? I didn't know anymore. But what I did know was that Mr. Benjamin had seen me. He had spoken to me. And he had looked at me with an expression that was burned into my mind. A mixture of sadness and something else. Something worse. Not anger. Not fear. Resignation. Like he had known this moment was coming. Like he had done this before. My body ached with exhaustion, but my mind refused to shut down. I needed to know more. I needed to know what Mr. Benjamin had done to Samuel. What he was still doing now. Because this wasn't just a haunted statue. This was something worse. And I had to figure it out before it was too late. The next day, I made a decision. I had to go back. Not to the statue. Not to Mr. Benjamin. To his house. It was dangerous. Probably the stupidest thing I had ever done. But I didn't care. I had come too far, and I had seen too much. If I stopped now, I wouldn't just be left with questions. I would be left with fear. And that was something I refused to live with. I waited until late afternoon, when I saw Mr. Benjamin leave his house. He walked down the street toward town, just like he had done a few times before. This was my chance. Heart pounding, I slipped out of my house and made my way toward his front door. It was locked, but I had expected that. I checked the windows. The one on the side of the house was cracked open just a sliver, probably to let in some air. Good enough. I pried it open carefully, wincing as it creaked, and hoisted myself inside. The air in the house was heavy. Not just stuffy, like a home that hadn't been aired out properly. Heavy in a way that felt wrong. Like stepping into a place that had been sealed off from the world for too long. A place where things had happened. things that had left an imprint on the walls, on the air itself. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding as I crept forward. The inside of the house was surprisingly neat. The furniture was old but well maintained, the floors free of dust. The walls were lined with old photos, most of them black and white, showing faces I didn't recognize. But there was one picture that stopped me cold. A photo of a boy with dark, hollow eyes. Samuel. I didn't need to be told. I just knew. His face was young, his expression serious. But there was something in his eyes. Something distant. Something afraid. I tore my gaze away and continued down the hall. And then I found it. A door. Not just any door. It was different from the others. Older. The wood was darker, rougher, the handle rusted. And it had a lock. Not a standard lock. Not a deadbolt. A heavy, industrial-style lock that looked out of place in a house like this. Why would anyone need a lock like this on a door inside their own home? I knew the answer, and I didn't want to be right. I hesitated only for a second before gripping the handle. It turned. I pushed. The door groaned open, and I stepped inside. The basement was dark, darker than it should have been. The second I stepped onto the stairs, the air turned frigid. A deep, unnatural cold that seeped into my skin, making my breath hitch. I flicked on my flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness. And then I saw them. Symbols. Carved into the walls, the floor, the wooden beams. Strange, jagged markings that didn't look like any language I recognized. And in the center of the room, a table. A large stone slab. The surface was covered in deep scratches, like something had clawed at it. And beside it, a book. I took a step closer, my pulse hammering in my ears. The book was old, its leather cover cracked and peeling. The pages inside were yellowed, filled with more of those strange symbols. But there were also pictures, diagrams. My hands shook as I flipped through them. One of them showed a human figure, surrounded by markings. Another showed a statue. And another. My breath caught. It was an illustration of a man, standing over a stone figure, his hands raised. And beneath it, in faded English text, were the words, "Preservation of the soul." I felt sick. This wasn't just a ritual. This was something worse. Something real. I turned the page, my stomach twisting. More diagrams. More symbols. Then, a final note, written in English, in a shaky, uneven hand. It is not death. It is not life. The body is preserved, but the mind. The sentence cut off abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted. I slammed the book shut, my hands trembling. I knew what Mr. Benjamin had done. I knew what the statue was. It wasn't just a tribute to his son. It was his son. Not dead. Not alive. Trapped. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I needed to get out of here. I needed to. Creak. I froze. A sound. Not from upstairs. Not from outside. From behind me. I turned slowly. The basement was still empty. Or at least it looked empty. But the air had changed. It felt heavier. Colder. And then, a whisper. Right next to my ear. "Help me." I ran. I didn't care about being quiet. Didn't care if Mr. Benjamin heard me. I bolted up the stairs, flung open the door, and sprinted out of the house. I didn't stop until I was inside my own home, the door locked behind me. My lungs burned. My body trembled. But worse than that, I knew the truth now. I knew what Mr. Benjamin had done. And I knew that Samuel was still there. Still trapped. Still watching. And I had the terrible, sinking feeling that he didn't want to be alone anymore. I sat on the floor of my living room, my back pressed against the locked door, my entire body trembling. My mind raced, trying to process everything I had just seen, everything I had just learned. Samuel wasn't dead. At least, not in the way people thought of death. His body had been transformed, preserved in stone, but his soul, his consciousness, it was still there, trapped, imprisoned, by his own father. Mr. Benjamin had done something to him, performed some sort of ritual, a process designed to keep Samuel frozen in time. It wasn't just a statue. It was him, and he was suffering. I had heard his voice. "Help me." I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to steady my breathing, but the panic wouldn't fade. The weight of what I had uncovered pressed down on me, making my chest feel tight, my vision blurry. What was I supposed to do? Who would believe me? I could call the police, sure, but what would I tell them? That my neighbor had turned his son into a statue? That the thing in his yard was alive? They'd think I was insane. Hell, I thought I was insane. But I had seen it. I had felt it. Samuel was trapped. And I was the only one who knew. Which meant I was the only one who could do something about it. I didn't leave my house for the rest of the day. I kept all the doors locked, all the curtains shut, the weight of my discovery hanging over me like a storm cloud. But as night fell, a dreadful realization crept into my mind. Mr. Benjamin had seen me leave his house. He had seen me snooping around. He knew what I had done, which meant he wasn't going to just let me walk away. I gripped the baseball bat tighter, my hands clammy with sweat. Every sound made me flinch. The creak of the house settling, the rustle of wind against the windows, the distant hum of a passing car. I wasn't safe. And then, a noise. Something outside. My breath hitched, my entire body freezing as I strained to listen. Footsteps. Soft. Careful. Coming from my backyard. My fingers tightened around the bat, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. Slowly, I crawled toward the window, pushing the curtain aside just an inch. The backyard was dark, the dim glow of the moon casting long shadows across the grass. And standing there, just beyond the porch, was Mr. Benjamin. I swallowed a gasp, my blood turning to ice. He was facing my house, completely still, his hands tucked into the pockets of his long coat. He wasn't moving, wasn't knocking, wasn't calling out to me, just standing there, watching, waiting, a silent threat. I clenched my jaw, willing myself not to panic. He couldn't just break in. That would be insane. That would get him caught. But deep down, I knew he didn't have to. He could just wait. Wait until I made a mistake. Wait until fear drove me outside. Wait until I let my guard down. He knew I had read that book. He knew I had found out the truth. And now I was a problem he needed to get rid of. I forced myself to back away from the window, my pulse racing. If I stayed locked inside, I might be safe for the night. But what about tomorrow? Or the next day? I had two options. I could pack my things and leave town. Forget everything I had seen. Pretend this had never happened. Or I could confront him. A shiver ran through me. The idea of facing Mr. Benjamin terrified me. But the thought of leaving Samuel like this, leaving him trapped, that was worse. I had to do something. I had to act. Before it was too late. I didn't wait until morning. The idea of spending the entire night in my house, knowing Mr. Benjamin was outside, was unbearable. So I did the only thing I could think of. I went to him. My entire body trembled as I unlocked the back door, stepping out into the cold night air. The wind bit at my skin, but I barely noticed. Mr. Benjamin didn't move as I approached. His face was calm, expressionless, like he had expected this. "You shouldn't have gone into my house, Dylan," he said quietly. His voice was level, steady, but there was something underneath it. Something cold. Something dangerous. I swallowed hard, keeping my grip firm on the bat. "What did you do to him?" My voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. For the first time, something flickered across Mr. Benjamin's face. Sadness, regret, or maybe something else entirely. "I did what I had to do," he murmured. A lump formed in my throat. "He's alive in there," I hissed. "He's trapped. He's safe," Mr. Benjamin interrupted. His tone sharpened, his jaw tightening. "Do you have any idea what would have happened to him if I hadn't done it? What they would have done to him?" I blinked. "What are you talking about?" Mr. Benjamin exhaled slowly, looking past me, toward the statue. "They were going to take him from me," he said. "I couldn't let that happen. I wouldn't let that happen." His hands curled into fists. "I found a way to protect him," he continued. "A way to keep him from being taken. A way to make sure they couldn't hurt him." My stomach twisted. This wasn't just a man who had lost his son. This was a man who had gone mad trying to keep him. Who was going to take him? I demanded. "What are you even talking about?" Mr. Benjamin didn't answer. He just turned his gaze back to me, his expression unreadable. And then, very softly, he said, "You've been talking to him, haven't you?" A cold chill ran down my spine. I didn't respond. His eyes darkened. "You think you can help him?" He took a step closer. "You think you can fix this?" I tightened my grip on the bat, my pulse skyrocketing. "Stay away from me," I warned. Mr. Benjamin sighed. "I don't want to hurt you, Dylan." My breath hitched. "But I can't let you interfere." And then, something moved. Not Mr. Benjamin. Not me. The statue. I heard it before I saw it. The faintest sound of stone shifting, a whisper of movement in the darkness. I whipped around, and my heart stopped. The statue's head was turned, facing us. Its mouth was slightly open now, and from its lips came a single, breathless word. "Run." A hand clamped down on my wrist. "Mr. Benjamin." I wrenched myself free and bolted, his voice shouting behind me, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back, because I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. I ran. My feet pounded against the pavement as I sprinted away from Mr. Benjamin's yard, my breath ragged, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see if he was chasing me. I didn't want to see the statue, its lifeless stone eyes following my movements. I just wanted to escape. But no matter how far I ran, I knew the truth. This wasn't over. I couldn't just pretend this never happened. I couldn't forget what I had seen, what I had heard. Samuel had spoken to me, and he had told me to run. But why? Was he warning me about his father? Or was there something worse lurking beneath the surface of this nightmare? I needed answers. But more than that, I needed to end this. I spent the next few hours locked inside my house, pacing the floor, my mind racing with possibilities. Calling the police wouldn't help. If I told them what I knew, they'd either think I was crazy or assume I had been trespassing and arrest me instead of him. No, I needed proof. Proof that Samuel was alive. Proof that Mr. Benjamin had done something to him. The security footage. My hands trembled as I grabbed my laptop, pulling up the recording from the camera I had set up days ago. I fast-forwarded through the hours of footage, watching the darkened yard, the unmoving statue. I almost thought I had imagined it all, until at around 3 in the morning I saw it. Movement. At first it was subtle, a twitch of a finger, a slow tilt of the head. Then the statue turned. I sucked in a sharp breath. It moved jerkily, unnaturally, like something struggling against invisible restraints. Its mouth opened, as if gasping for air, though I knew it had no lungs. And then, as I watched in stunned horror, it took a step forward. The stone cracked at its joints, tiny fragments breaking off as it forced itself to move. It looked agonizing, as if the very act of shifting its form was painful. And then suddenly, the screen went black. I stared, my pulse thundering in my ears. The camera hadn't died. The recording hadn't stopped. It had been shut off. By someone. By him. Mr. Benjamin knew. A slow, creeping terror settled in my bones. I was running out of time. I had to do something now. I had to save Samuel. I returned to Mr. Benjamin's house just before dawn. The neighborhood was quiet. No cars passed by. No curious eyes peered from behind curtains. It was as if the entire street was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The front door was locked, but I knew another way in. The basement window. I moved quickly, my pulse hammering as I crouched near the side of the house, prying the window open with shaking hands. I didn't let myself hesitate. I slipped inside. The basement was cold, the air thick with the scent of old books, melted wax, and something else. Something metallic. Something like blood. I swallowed hard, forcing myself forward. The book was still there, resting on the wooden table. The same book I had seen the first time. The one filled with strange symbols and rituals I didn't understand. And beside it, a knife. Long dull. Stained. My stomach churned, while rising in my throat. I didn't want to think about what it had been used for. I turned, scanning the basement, searching for any clue as to what Mr. Benjamin's endgame was. That's when I saw it. Another statue. It wasn't like the one outside. This one was smaller, cruder, less lifelike. But the eyes, they were identical to Samuel's. Mr. Benjamin had done this before, and he would do it again. A shadow moved in the doorway. I barely had time to react before a hand clamped over my mouth. Dylan. Mr. Benjamin's voice was low, controlled. I struggled, but his grip was iron. You shouldn't be here. I wrenched myself free, stumbling backward. You, I gasped. You killed him. You did something horrible. His face darkened. I saved him. No, you trapped him. I shouted. He's suffering. I heard him. He asked me for help. For the first time, Mr. Benjamin's expression faltered. He spoke to you? I hesitated, then nodded. Something flickered in his eyes. Panic. No, he muttered. That's not possible. The ritual. He turned, as if realizing something, and his face went pale. I followed his gaze. Samuel's statue. It was gone. The door behind me slammed open. Wind howled through the basement, extinguishing the candles, plunging the room into darkness. And then, a voice. Soft. Hollow. Father. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. Samuel stood in the doorway. But he wasn't a statue anymore. His body was cracked, splintered, his stone flesh breaking apart, revealing glimpses of something underneath. Something human. He was changing. Mr. Benjamin took a step back, horror etched across his face. No, he whispered. You weren't supposed to wake up. Samuel lifted his head. His eyes glowed, eerie and unearthly. You did this to me, he murmured. Mr. Benjamin's breath hitched. I saved you. Samuel shook his head. You stole my life. The air around us crackled with energy, the walls trembling. And then, Samuel moved. He reached out, his fingers grazing his father's arm. Mr. Benjamin screamed. I watched in frozen horror as his body began to change, his skin paling, hardening, his veins turning to stone. His face contorted in agony, his eyes pleading, his mouth open in a silent cry. But there was no stopping it. Within seconds, he was nothing more than a statue. A perfect, frozen image of a man trapped in his final moment of terror. Silence fell. Samuel stood over him, his breathing unsteady, his body still shifting between stone and flesh. Then, slowly, he turned to me. I stiffened, my heart pounding. Was he going to do the same to me? But instead, he smiled. A small, sad smile. "Thank you." And then, he collapsed. The stone cracked away, falling in pieces to the floor. And beneath it, a boy. A real, breathing human boy. I rushed to his side, shaking him. "Samuel?" His eyes fluttered open. For the first time in years, he was free. The next day, the police found a new statue in Mr. Benjamin's yard. A statue of a man, his face contorted in horror. I told them I had no idea what had happened, and they believed me. No one asked where Samuel had gone. No one remembered he had ever existed. But I did, and as I drove away from that cursed house, taking Samuel with me, I knew one thing for certain. The nightmare was finally over. Or at least, I hoped it was. And so, the story comes to an end. A tale of mystery, fear, and secrets buried beneath the stillness of a statue. But even as the night deepens, one question lingers. Was it truly over? Or do some things remain unseen, waiting in the quiet? Let these thoughts drift through your mind like ripples on a calm lake. Feel the weight of the story settle, like a whisper carried by the wind. The world outside is still, the night embracing you in its quiet presence. If this story kept you wondering, if it made you feel something, curiosity, chills, or even a sense of wonder, let me know in the comments. What would you have done in Dylan's place? Do you believe some mysteries are better left unsolved? Take a deep breath. Let go of the tension. The night is peaceful, and you are safe. Thank you for being here, for listening, for journeying through the unknown. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories to accompany your nights. Now close your eyes, let your thoughts settle, and drift into a restful sleep. Until next time, stay curious and sleep well.